program, a Hammer Forum on the Crisis in Iraq, with Molly Bingham and Haifa Zangana in conversation with Laura Flanders. Before I turn things over to Laura, I want to remind you to please silence your cell phones and let you know that there's an emergency exit in the rear of the theater under the red lights. I also want to remind you about a couple of upcoming Hammer Forums. We're hosting a debate on immigration on April 9th and a discussion about energy independence on May 6th. These events, like all of our public programs, are free, and you can find out more information about them in the lobby or online. So on to tonight's moderator. Laura Flanders has appeared here at the Hammer on a half-dozen occasions, most recently last year with her latest book, Blue Grit, Making Impossible, Improbable, and Inspirational Political Change in America. She's the host of Radio Nation on Air America Radio. In LA, that's KTLK 1150 AM. And she writes regularly for The Nation magazine and other outlets. And she says that she has a new web and satellite television program in the works. Longtime journalist, broadcaster, and friend of the Hammer, please join me in welcoming Laura Flanders.
Thank you. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, everybody. Come take your seats. I'm going to introduce our wonderful our panelists here, but I wanted to take just a moment to thank everybody for coming out and to thank the Hammer for making this evening possible. We have two extraordinary speakers here. We're going to be engaged in a conversation. On my far left, your right, we have Molly Bingham, a freelance photojournalist and co-director with Steve Connor of some of the film that we're going to see some of called Meeting the Resistance. We are going to hear more about Meeting the Resistance in just a moment. In the middle of the room here, in the middle of our platform, Haifa Zangana, who is a novelist and author, most recently of this wonderful book that's available after called City of Widows. She writes for The Guardian, she writes for Red Pepper in the UK, for Al-Quds, Al-Haram, and much more. I want to introduce this evening by thinking a little bit about 5 years. 5 years. Did we think we would be here in 5 years? I'll tell you, coming here this evening made me think of where I was 5 years ago, and it was almost exactly here. It was actually at the Royce Hall in a forum with Gore Vidal. We were holding a discussion. How many of you were there? Anybody there? It was a wild night, wasn't it? There were probably 2,000 so people, packed capacity crowd, 2,000 more outside. It ended up being actually not the night of the invasion itself, but the night before. And we were in a very nervous state, very divided about what might be about to happen, very concerned. And I remember Gore Vidal was very scared. And my memory of that night is Gore Vidal in the prep period, in this moment. Gore Vidal had a bodyguard with him, and he had us walking through our things of what to do, our steps of what to do if somebody should shoot or fire a bullet at Gore. And the bodyguard was going to rush out from the side and hurl himself on Gore. And I said to I sort of was like, excuse me, what about me? So that was 5 years ago. And we went home to our hotel rooms, and in the next few days saw what the U.S. media went wild with calling shock and awe. And we heard about how this wasn't going to cost us anything. As American people, not in terms of money, not in terms of people, not in terms of time. U.S. spokespeople said things like William Crystal said, having defeated and then occupied Iraq, democratizing the country should not be too tall an order for the world's sole superpower. Barbara Bush, remember what she said? She was asked about U.S. casualties, and she said, why should we hear about body bags and deaths? Oh, I mean, it's not relevant. So why should I waste my beautiful mind on something like that? That's what she said to Good Morning America. And Kenneth Pollock from the National Security Council said it wouldn't cost us anything. It's unimaginable that the U.S. would have to contribute hundreds of billions of dollars, and highly unlikely that we would have to contribute even tens of billions of dollars, he said. We were told, of course, about sweets and roses. Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney told us our troops would be welcomed with sweets and roses. And sure enough, in all that footage, we were led to conclude that something like that had happened. The U.S. had invaded, they had defeated the Iraqi old regime, the statue toppled, a shiny new democracy in Iraq was just around the corner. In fact, a shiny new Iraq was just around the corner. It was all going to come to Iraqis courtesy of the U.S. Well, I think we've heard a lot since. 4,000 US service people dead, 8,000 Iraqi soldiers dead, over 1 million Iraqi civilians dead, 4 million refugees, the worst and most urgently growing refugee crisis in the world. We've heard a lot since about poor planning, poor logistics, the wrong Americans in charge, what we didn't understand about how to do this kind of an occupation. What I think we've missed in all of this is the most fundamental failure, which was the failure to understand the Iraqi people. And I was thinking about this the other day when I was at the Winter Soldier hearings in Washington, D.C. How many people saw footage of Winter Soldier on Free Speech TV or Link or online? And there was a young man, hundreds of U.S. service people, active duty and vets, spoke about what they had done, what they'd been part of, what they had done in our name in Iraq. One, Camilo Mejia, spoke. He's the first active duty soldier who refused service and he refused to serve in Iraq on his second tour and ended up serving time, 8 months in the brig for it. Camilo Mejia talked about never being able to forget what he'd done in Iraq, and at the same time not being able to remember the details either. He talked about a situation where he had been part of a checkpoint, a U.S. checkpoint in Baghdad, that had fired on a man who was approaching the checkpoint with his son, and had fired with such powerful weapons at the guy that the man was beheaded. And he remembers the scene, and he said, I remembered the scene, I'll never forget the scene of this man and the young boy next to him that I learned later was his son. It'll live with me forever, but I've erased the face. He said that's what the mind does in a period of, in a trauma, in a situation of trauma. It erases the face, the details. And I think the reason that I'm glad we're here tonight, and the reason I've brought these two extraordinary people here tonight, is because I think what the U.S., what we as a people did even before the invasion and the occupation began, was to erase the face of the Iraqi people. And what we need to do at this moment, at this very critical moment, is put that face back on. We're going to talk a little bit about the situation that we're in right now. George Bush may have got it right. He called this last week a defining moment in the history of Iraq, certainly in the history of the U.S. Presence in Iraq, and he may have been right. This week, I don't know how many of you are aware of what's been happening in Iraq, but essentially we've been telling the Iraqi government of Nouri al-Maliki to step up and take responsibility. And step up he did, and he decided to attack the biggest Shia organization in the country, the Mehdi army of Muqtada al-Sadr, headquartered in Basra. And after 3 days of being engaged in street-to-street hand-to-hand combat, the government of Nouri al-Maliki called in the US and the British for help. And the only reason it wasn't a total rout of the Iraqi army was because the US and British used air power and ground power to take down Muqtada's forces. The fact was, most of the Iraqi army wouldn't fight, the police wouldn't fight, and the Iraqi television caught these rather embarrassing pictures of the Iraqi army handing over their guns to the Mehdi forces of Muqtada al-Sadr. Clearly, however, the Prime Minister of Nouri al-Maliki has learned a few things from George W. Bush. This is what he was quoted as saying today in the USA Today. He said, he declared victory. Nouri al-Maliki declared victory over Muqtada al-Sadr's forces, saying that he had crushed what remained of their presence in Basra. The Sadrists control more areas in Basra than when the fighting began, said a lawmaker who had helped to broker a ceasefire. The fact is, the Sadrists controlled 3/4 of the city of Basra. The Iraqi army wasn't able to even bring back control into the second biggest city of Iraq, even with US and British help. The US has now made lines in Iraq where there weren't before. We have a war where the US is at the center. What divides Sadr and al-Maliki is really their position on the US occupation. The US has made a war in Iraq, which is now setting the Shia population against itself. And the US is firmly on the wrong side of that debate. What we need right this minute is some facts, some faces, some people in this picture, and to talk about what happens next. So I'm very excited to have with us Molly Bingham, Haifa Zangana, and we'll start the conversation. Thanks so much, everybody, for coming. I said where I was on the night of the invasion. I would love the two of you to start by talking about where you were. You want to begin, Haifa?
Yeah, well, I was in a family house in London, and my husband, as a defense mechanism, he kept all the time sleeping, night after night, actually, while I couldn't at all. So I was awake like 2 days before. We weren't sure that it will happen. It's like sometimes you watch someone you love and he or she dying, and you know very well the person will die, it's terminal, and you've been told that, yet you still look at them and you think with a great love, definitely your love, your care is going to keep those people alive. No way they're going to lose their lives. That was our feeling about Iraq, that the attack will not take place. Perhaps the world, perhaps the American people will do something.
Where were you, Haifa?
Yeah, I was in London in my house, but again, we were very busy all the time while we were watching between Al Jazeera and trying to reach our families in Baghdad and other cities.
Tell us a little bit about your family.
Well, the family, I have my eldest brother, my sister, and also we were worried about my niece because my niece was pregnant and she was due like 3 weeks after the invasion, but she had to queue in front of hospitals like many other Iraqi young women were pregnant in order to induce the birth, cesareans. They had cesareans, so they were queuing because they did not know what will happen to them when the bombardment will start or the war starts. So that's another thing. And we tried to reach, we actually managed to reach Baghdad in the first couple of days, despite the bombardment. But then the third day, I think, of the shock and awe, all the telephone stopped altogether, and also we were trying to ring all the people we know. Maybe one of them know what's happening. Maybe there are news that we cannot see. With all this coverage of the news, of the media 24 hours, we were trying to reach by every possible link, to reach the people we know, to reach the country, hoping deep down also that they will fight.
Molly, where were you?
Having spent my professional life as a conflict photojournalist, I arrived in Baghdad 2 days before the invasion started, and was in the Palestine Hotel when the bombing started, and had gone there to cover what the Iraqi experience was going to be under this much advertised shock and awe. And the first evening of the bombing was literally physically shaking. I mean, when the bombing started, a group of us were up on the roof of the Palestine Hotel, which overlooked what's now the Green Zone, the palaces and the Saddam's sort of key central area and some of the ministries. And it was just this, bomb after bomb after bomb, these huge explosions, and the whole city seemed to be shaking in this reverberation of bombing. And you would see tracer fire going up and anti-aircraft fire and jets, and it was an impressive show of force, but entirely one-sided. I mean, there was very little in the way of response from the Iraqi military, except for the anti-aircraft fire, really.
Talk about that for a minute. I mean, one of the things that we got, one of the impressions that we got after the shock and awe was that the Iraqi army had been vanquished. We found out afterwards that, in fact, most of the army had simply melted away. We saw a lot of pictures of burnt out tanks and things, but when people investigated, they found nobody had been in the tanks when they were fired upon. What was the significance of that narrative, do you think, to what happened next? The sense that the US had somehow won and that Iraqis were somehow defeated, and that there was some parallel that people drew to, well, the last two big wars, World War I and World War II, particularly World War II, Japan and Germany. This was a vanquished nation.
I mean, I think the Iraqis knew, the Iraqi population largely, but definitely the military, was highly aware there was no way they were going to be able to repulse this invasion. I mean, it was just not physically possible on their part. And they did essentially melt away. One of the people that we interviewed for the film was a Republican Guard, and I wasn't in the country at the time that this happened. When Baghdad fell, I was back in New York. But he told a story about he was the liaison between the front line and the presidency. And on the day before, on April 8th, it was about an hour round trip between the front line and the presidency. And he went out to get information about the troops and where they were, and saw the tanks pointed west towards where the Americans were coming into the city. And he went back to the presidency to take the information. In the 45 minutes that he came back, he said everybody was gone. Everybody was gone. And the one of the things about reporting the troop presences to the presidency was that the commanders were not allowed to report. They were only allowed to report injuries and deaths. They weren't allowed to report absenteeism. So a unit of 200 men, let's say, might have 110 people that just didn't show up and 20 wounded. So, but they looked to be at almost full strength because of those numbers. So there was the military melted away. And when I got back into Baghdad, you could see that. I mean, there were pairs of boots and army uniforms under bridges, and abandoned tanks and military equipment all over the place, all around the city. So that was apparently a victory, but one that had, I would say, a deferred fight.
So, Haifa, you're in London watching all of this, and you ended by saying you had been hoping secretly, or maybe not so secretly, that the Iraqis would fight. What were you making of what you saw?
Yeah, well, part of Iraq, especially in the south, which was surprising for many people, because they always portrayed the south as the area of majority of Shiites who they had the Intifada before that, and they were let down by the Americans, by Bush Senior at that time in the 90s. So those are the people who are going actually to receive the American and the British troops with the flowers and sweets. That did not happen. The irony is those are the people who fought really fiercely in the south, and it lasted over, I think, something like 10 days, the fighting, despite the fact that there was no hope whatsoever.
Well, how do you explain that when you say surprisingly? Why?
Well, it's surprisingly because we knew, I mean, the Iraqi army was totally weakened under the sanctions. There were no ammunitions for them. There was no updating whatsoever in their weaponry. They had no the power airplanes whatsoever. So they were absolutely really weak army. And also it's near Najaf that they were the resistance started the other end also, which is another Shiite area where the holy city. So we had it both. And also, I mean, now we know from documents appearing and from long interviews with officers in the army that they are the people who are now leading the resistance. And there is kind of misinformation about the Iraqi army, because it's been for a couple of years before the invasion that it's been ballooned into this is the army of Saddam Hussein. In Iraq, traditionally, the army is very respected, and it's always associated with the national liberation, with the struggle in Palestine. So it has a fantastic feeling about it among Iraqis.
And
Go ahead.
predates Saddam. It predates the Ba'athists. I was just going to say, too, I think that one of the great ironies of this war for America, maybe not for the Iraqis, is I think it was instigated or aspired to be a show of tremendous force in the region, and how great America's military might is. And in the 5 years since the invasion, it has done nothing but reveal our weaknesses, our incapacities, the things that we are incapable or don't know how to do or can't carry through. And the fact that you know, what could be described as, you know, guys in flip-flops with AKs can basically stop the American military machine in its tracks. I mean, that is not strength.
And are doing it more now than ever. Go back to this question of the U.S. impression versus the reality when it comes to the military, and begin, Molly, if you would, to talk about how you began to get interested in understanding this resistance. The film Meeting Resistance takes us back to that first year of the occupation. The U.S., we were being told that, well, as I said, Iraq had been kind of vanquished, and then when some violence came, we were told, well, it's a few dead enders, hangers on. And then we were told, well, it's only people who are desperate for money. They're doing it for money. And now we're told it's because they're being told to fight by Iran. What was the reality as you found it?
Well, Steve Connors and I, who did the reporting for the film together, were in Baghdad, both working as still photographers after Baghdad had fallen. And if you were in Iraq, you were aware that quite shortly after the fall of Baghdad, there were sporadic, small-scale attacks against American troops. Early, it started off as sort of one here, one there. Every few days, you would hear about something. Some of them seemed revenge-oriented. An Iraqi would approach an American soldier and sort of shoot them at point-blank range and then disappear. Others were slightly more military attacks in that they would be ambushes of American convoys. But Steve would look into that, and he has a history as British military, and he would say these aren't really professional military attacks because they're not pressing home advantages they have. And so it was the dead enders, Ba'athi diehards, that became common criminals. Originally it was called mopping up operations against Iraqi military units that were still functioning, which also didn't seem to match. Anyway, it grew more significant, and it became every day that there were attacks. And Steve and I have 30 plus years combined experience covering conflicts around the world, and covering both or all sides of any particular conflict is sort of in our mandate as journalists. And we didn't see any reason why there should be a different standard for this war. So we waited a little bit to see. We were tired, frankly. We went home and had a break for a few weeks, and in August of 2003 came back to see if we could find who these people were and go directly to them, go to the source, find people who are engaged in this fight. Who are they? What kinds of people are they? What kinds of backgrounds are they from? Is that consistent? Is it homogenous? You know, are they Ba'ath Party members? Were they ever? Did they serve in the military? What role does religion play in their lives? How do they feel about Saddam? When did they start? Which was one of the most important questions. And of the people, we talked about 45 people in the one neighborhood that we spend our time in, Adamia. 10 of those people agreed to go on camera and be interviewed. Of those people, 9 of them explained that they had started their fight within 2 weeks of the fall of Baghdad. So they didn't wait to see. I mean, I think there's a myth about, well, the occupation was run poorly. If the Americans had done this better, or if it had been a different administration, I think is even implied. It's a criticism of the Republicans particularly, that all of this would have gone much more smoothly. And what Steve and I found is that, in fact, when you occupy another country, you get resistance. And it doesn't really matter where you are in history or where you are on the globe. That is a reality. And I think that Meeting Resistance, the film, is clearly about Iraq. It's shaped and colored and textured by the history and religion and social norms of Iraq. But when you take a step back, it's really a study of the human condition under occupation. And I think that Americans, for some reason, were surprised that all the rules of occupation and resistance would also actually apply to us. And I think that's basically what we found.
Let's go to a clip of the film. I want you to introduce it. Haifa and I will step down. We're going to watch a bit of the film. We're going to come back, talk some more, and take some questions. We are, I think, at a defining moment of this U.S. occupation, and understanding what has brought the U.S. and all of us to this point is the task at hand.
Sure. So just
Molly.
briefly to introduce what you're going to see, it's a clip from pretty much the heart of the film, the middle of the film. And there's some things to be explained, which is that the individuals that are being interviewed who are active in the insurgency in the resistance, their images are blurred, their faces are blurred, so that's not a problem with the projector. It's actually the way the film is shot, and that had to be done in camera because that was part of our survival tactic for getting through this story. The other thing is that we never knew these individuals' real names, and so in our first interview with each individual, we would agree on a title, a character, an iconographic name, if you will, that described who they are in their society. So you have the teacher, the warrior, the traveler, and these were basically, again, constructs, and we can talk about this later if you're interested, but it was a very dangerous project to do, and these were some distance that we put between ourselves and these fighters, so that the amount of information we had about them was limited, and they knew that, and so it would be difficult for them to trace back any problems they had or arrests they had to us. And so you're going to see in the middle of the film, they have talked about their motivation, they've talked about when they've started, they've talked about their weapons and funding and how they organize their groups. And this is basically where they start describing their tactics and their targets. And it's about a 10-minute clip that will explain that and address some of the issues. And it's I think we can go ahead and roll that if you guys ready.
Resistance. The website is meetingresistance.com. People can buy tapes. And just to clarify, nothing has changed all that much. I mean, this weekend, the Green Zone was under such heavy shelling that all the top leaders, diplomatic and military, had to go into a downstairs basement, underground shelter. And the Iraqi spokesperson, one of the Iraqi spokespersons most associated with articulating the U.S. administration's position on the so-called surge, the Baghdad security plan. Last week, that guy was kidnapped, taken hostage. 3 of his bodyguards were killed, and his house was burnt down. So much for security. Molly wanted to say one last thing about the film.
Yeah,
I have a question, of course.
I just think it's helpful to contextualize for an American audience in particular that it's helpful to think about what's happening in Iraq, or what was even happening when we were making this film, as really being 2 wars. There is a war against occupation, and overwhelmingly since 2004, the majority of attacks in Iraq have targeted the U.S.-led coalition forces. 74% of attacks have targeted the U.S.-led coalition forces. 10% have targeted civilians, and that is indicative. That is the civil war, which is the second war. And the civil war is between, in my understanding and my perspective, and maybe Haifa would like to talk about this too, is between is political, and is about 2 competing visions for the future of Iraq. One is a nationalist, one Iraq with a strong central government, and the other one is a partitionist vision of Iraq's future with a weakened central government and strong sort of statelets that are largely divided along sectarian lines. So the civil war really takes a political shape rather than a sectarian one, and we've seen fighting that has really illustrated that, I think, in the last week in Iraq. So that was, I just wanted to
Well, let me have you pick up on that, Haifa. How would you characterize the different forces in Iraq right now, and what are the most significant differences, particularly among the different Shiite groups?
Well, I think the overall picture is, if we want to put it simply, is there is the occupation and anti-occupation forces. The occupation with, as been mentioned by the resistance fighters, there are the people who are anti-occupation, and there is those people who are the politicians and the political parties with their militias. Most of them, they came from outside the country, inside with the occupation, and they are most of the fighting at the moment, or it's even part of this 10% which Molly mentioned, is actually the fighting among themselves on the looting of the money, on the resources of Iraq, the oil and other things. But it's not really a civil war in a sense that it is among Iraqis, the general public, the general people, Iraqi people. It is those politicians with their own militias. And most of them have no roots in Iraqi society, except for what's happened in the last week, actually, between the forces in south of Iraq.
What would you say is the most significant difference between the Sadr forces, those are the Muqtada al-Sadr, Mehdi army, people in Basra, also in Baghdad, and the Nouri al-Maliki's forces that include other units, but also the Iraqi government?
Well, Sadr forces and the Mehdi army in general being considered to be representative of the Arabic side of the Shiite in Iraq, while the Maliki and representing Ad-Da'wah and the Supreme Council Al-Hakim for the Islamic Revolution, these two parties, especially Al-Hakim, with his own party and a brigade, the militia, they were established in Iran and moved on inside Iraq. So the clashes between, but I see it in different way also, not just the political or whether being established in Iran or inside, but almost there is a class struggle because Al-Mahdi army and the follower of Muqtada are the poorest of the poor, while the rest, the two political parties, are really what have been along over decades and decades in charge of the revenues of the fifth, which is part of a huge amount of money, billions, we're talking about billions of money, a revenue which comes to the Shiites from around the world to the holy places.
But isn't it true that the Muqtada al-Sadr group left the Maliki government last summer precisely over the government's failure to make a timetable for U.S. troop withdrawal?
Oh, they do, because they have a clear picture regarding the occupation. They do not want the occupation in Iraq, and they think the Iraqi people themselves have to settle their differences among themselves, while Maliki and Al-Hakim, both of them are totally backed by the occupation.
Molly.
It's also worth making a distinction between the parliament, which basically does represent the population fairly well in its anti-occupation. It's called for a withdrawal. It thinks that the country should stay together, and I think it is against the oil law generally, the new oil law. But the executive branch is highly partitionist and is in the hands of Maliki and the strongest scary movements, and they control the most important ministries, the finance, interior, and oil ministry. So, I mean, there are all these factors that play out on the ground, which are very complicated, but ultimately not so complicated, I think.
Let's, having laid out a little bit of the politics and then the military situation, the militia situation, let me come back to the personal for a moment, Haifa, and have you talk about your history. We haven't touched yet, Molly, on your experience and how you ended up in Abu Ghraib for 8 days. This is the anniversary of your release. We'll get to that in just a minute. But Haifa, in your book, City of Widows, you talk about resistance, and you end by saying that while we talk about resistance today in the way that we've been doing, resistance in Iraq is decades long, and you were part of it at one point.
Well, it's if we look back at Iraq while it was under the British colonialism in the 20s, it was occupied 1917 of the last century, and then the first revolution was in 1920. So the Iraqis are not strangers for resistance, and they fought fiercely against the occupation of their country. It took them few decades to get rid of it totally, and if you look at that period, decade after decade, you'll see the resemblance of events parallel to what's happening at the moment, as starting from the mandate or imposing semi-independent or what's called sovereign government, which imposed by the British, like what's happening today, an Iraqi government supposedly to represent Iraqi people, which did not in the end, until the 1958 revolution, 14th of July, where we got rid of the monarchy imposed by the British. So that was the main period where the first republic was established. But also we resisted and we fought for many decades under, we fought the Ba'ath regime. To start with as a regime, and then the Ba'ath party, and then under Saddam's dictatorship. It was a brutal regime, and we were denied our political freedom. So we paid a high price then. Still, I mean, the idea was never to replace a dictatorship with occupation. We did not fight for this. That's why we feel very, very angry and outraged about what's happening at the moment. The kind of life we paid and the blood we paid for democracy, because we were believers in democracy. And democracy, sadly to say nowadays, it's almost either a joke in Iraq or a dirty word. We cannot defend democracy anymore because of what's happening at the moment.
You say your book is called City of Widows, and you said that when you were writing it, which I guess was 2005, 6,
Yes.
According to the officials from the Ministry of Women's Affairs in Baghdad alone, there was something like 300,000 widows. Do you have any idea what number you've got today, and what can you tell us a bit about what life is like?
A couple of months ago, that we have a new figure, which is by the Ministry of Human Rights in Iraq. And funny enough, we have one in Iraq. And this is, it's 1.5 million. They're putting the figure of widows in all over the country, which give you an idea. If you, I mean, bearing in mind that Iraqi family consists of average 5 children, that means we have, if we keep the 1 million widows, we have 5 million orphans also, and they are left to be the main household, the head of the household, to look after them.
Molly, you were detained during the occupation, during the invasion, right at the very beginning of the invasion. What the heck happened?
I'd just like to add something to what Haifa was saying about numbers before I go there, because I think it's really helpful for people to visualize the impact that this occupation has had on Iraqis. As you mentioned during your opening comments, there are at least 2.5 million refugees in Syria and Jordan. There are almost 2 million internally displaced Iraqis, so people who have left their homes but haven't left the country, so they're living in some other part of the country. And then there are somewhere between 650,000 and 1.2 million Iraqis who've died violent deaths because of the occupation since 2003. When you take that, it comes out to basically 1 out of every 6 or 7 Iraqis has fled the country, is internally displaced, or has died since 2003. And that also happens to be the size of the average nuclear family. So if you consider that 1 out of every nuclear family has had that kind of dramatic consequence of the invasion imposed on their life, it really, I think, puts it in context to the fact that Iraqis are paying tremendously high prices for our presence there right now. And then about Abu Ghraib, I went into Iraq to cover the war, to cover the invasion, to cover what it was like in Baghdad under that period of time. And I went in on a group visa, and it was renewed. They took another few $1,000s from us after we were there for a week. And basically one night, 3 of us that were on the same visa and then 2 journalists from Newsday were arrested and taken to Abu Ghraib and charged with spying. And we were all interrogated separately. We were kept in solitary confinement apart from each other and apart from other prisoners. And I would say that of all the possible things that could have gone on in that 8 days of my life, and I had spent a day in Tehran, actually, in December of 2002, before the war started, looking at an Iraqi prisoners group's photographs of Iraqis who'd been tortured in Abu Ghraib. So I was quite familiar with what their tactics had been with many other people. I have to say, none of that happened. I mean, yes, we were interrogated. Yes, it was terrifying. Yes, I was completely out of control of my destiny and future in a way that I have never been, and I hope to never be again. But we were treated with humanity. We were fed 3 meals. I was allowed to bathe. I was given some extra licenses because I was a woman. I think I'm one of the only women that was ever held at Abu Ghraib because it's a men's prison. Women were taken there for execution only. And the prison was basically empty at the time that we were there. There were a few other prisoners there. The irony of what became of Abu Ghraib under American oversight, if you will, and the torture at Abu Ghraib, is not lost on me. That I mean, I'm an American. My country is invading Iraq. There's a war on. I am accused of spying. I'm interrogated. I am found to be innocent, and I'm released. And I was not hurt. And the fact that we weren't able to subscribe to those same values when we were running that prison, to me, is a painful reminder of the values that we are not projecting, that we purport to subscribe to.
So to get to why you care about this, why did you go back after that and end up making this film, Meeting Resistance?
I mean, I didn't go back to make the film. I went back, I think, because for me personally, that period, that the prison time, is a tremendous failure as a journalist, particularly as a photographer. I mean, I went to cover the war. I ended up becoming the story, which was just not what I wanted at all. And I wanted to return to Iraq, and I returned to do a story about women political prisoners under the regime, which was, I felt, where perhaps the spotlight more accurately belonged, and hoping to sort of shift my narrative into something that was more constructive and more about Iraq. And so that was what I went back to do. And then in covering other stories and working for the New York Times and Newsweek and The Guardian and a host of other newspapers, traveling around the country doing stories, coming to understand what was happening in Iraq a little bit. I mean, as a real newcomer. I mean, I had not been to Iraq before the war, so I was learning it for the first time. And then my own history as a professional journalist and my obsession with people who fight for something that they believe in, covering who is the resistance and what is behind them, felt like a not only very natural step, but a critical step to anyone who wanted to talk about this war and the conflict that, I mean, the notion that it was over, it was just starting. And understanding that was just critical, fundamental to understanding the conflict at all.
Haifa, you able to go back since the US invaded?
Yeah, I went in 2004.
And that was your first time back after having been, would you call
29 years.
in exile?
Yeah, it was really preparing for that journey was absolutely like a dream, and I was dreading also that not recognizing anything, whether who RLC or the places and things.
When did you go?
But 2004, and I went to see my family. But the minute we crossed the border and there were nothing, I mean, we just walked inside Iraq. I was home, just home. And then when I went and I stayed my family's house, my brother and all, and the neighbors, they came, they were looking, and they kept saying, have you been living somewhere else in Baghdad? Just, well, no, I was away for 29 years. And but some people recognized the way that I must live somewhere because there were changes of words, like there were new words that people using, and I was stuck with my old Baghdadi accent and things. And I was once in the Sharjah, which is the market for spices and all, and I was looking for certain spices, and the salesman was looking at me, and I said, Khala, auntie, where have you been? This stopped existing for so many years, the thing you're asking for. It was relaxing. I had pains and aches in my body. I had allergies. Suddenly everything disappeared there. It wasn't fantastic time in terms of security, because I couldn't go out rarely unless someone else with me. We couldn't drive to the places. There were areas we couldn't reach at all. Yet the feeling of being at home. And I went to see my granddad's house, is still there, but the area absolutely so dangerous that you cannot walk. So it was very risky, and it's beautiful. Baghdad is a beautiful city.
Could you go back now?
Not really. It's very difficult because I'm on television most of the time, on satellite, and the airport is under the control of one militia, and it's very dangerous. And my family itself, they don't want me there anymore.
You write about this as being the worst moment for Iraqi women in their history, the worst moment for Iraqi women's lives. we can hear more about that and why that's the case. But I wanted you, before we talk about that, to talk about the best moment for Iraqi women. You were part of that too. Describe that a little bit. When and what
I
was that?
think it was in the 70s, definitely. Is the 70s were with the oil boom. We only just had the Ba'ath regime, but that it wasn't strong enough. It wasn't in full control of the country yet. The education is at its best, and the health service was really one of the best in the Middle East. Women were enjoying real freedom, equality, the laws, the new laws, and it lasted until the beginning of the Iraq-Iran war as well. As so that was
You fought for the
time.
right to wear miniskirts, as I recall.
Oh yes, yeah. I was one of them. I mean, I didn't have fantastic legs, but I tried my best anyway. Wearing really very, very skin tight things in hot summer in August in Baghdad, 50 degrees centigrade, to make my legs straight and all, and looked beautiful, and wearing the miniskirt. But I mean, you can see. I mean, if you compare the old pictures of Iraqi women at universities or at work with the photos nowadays, you wouldn't recognize that at all. It's a huge difference, and I'm not really condemning the way people wearing what they're wearing now, or I'm looking down at them. But I think what is lacking is the choice and the freedom of choice. We had the freedom of choice at that time, not anymore. No.
Where do you find hope today? And then we'll go to questions from the audience. Where do you see any spark of the kind of resistance that you were a part of, the kind of creative resistance?
Well, I think it is in the resistance itself. Iraqis are resisting the occupiers. That doesn't mean we hate Americans, we hate British people at all. In fact, Iraqis were almost thrilled to see people in the streets before the occupation demonstrating and showing their support to Iraqi people and saying it's not in our name, which is stuck in our minds. Or whoever I meet of Iraqis, they keep saying, well, people were in the streets to support us and all. But as time passes and as the occupation is staying longer, as the cost the lives we're paying is getting higher and higher, and the destruction is there. And also as we face with not silence, complete silence, because there are still people in America and Britain and in the West in general working and being activist and determined and resilient to support our right to rule ourselves, yet there is almost semi-silence there, and we need to do more. We hope for the solidarity of the British, the American people, and being you living in stability, in security. It's different than you living like Iraqis in a war zone. So you can afford to do more, to show your solidarity more, to tell that this is a senseless war. You did not want it to start. So do something further to make your government listen that you don't want it to last, in order to save lives, at least.
Molly, what about you? Do you see positive journalism out there? Do you see initiatives that you think are bringing people the truth about what's happening in Iraq?
Few and far between, I'm afraid. I mean, I think definitely there are journalists out there who are doing a good job. There are a lot of writers and a lot of Iraqi writers who've really come to the fore, who are writing in English, which is fantastic because Westerners, British, American, get to read this before invisible Iraqi presence that nobody really knew what it was. And so that's the blogging, that's all great. There's some really good writing going on out there. I think the Western mainstream media, particularly in America, is dangerously complicit in perpetrating an incredible propaganda about Iraq, about the conflict itself, about the people, about who opposes American presence, about what kind of fighting is really happening in Iraq. And that is something for me as a journalist that is just incredibly difficult to both stomach and understand. I think there are, again, there are a lot of individual journalists, Westerner journalists who work for mainstream organizations who do great work. They describe their daily life as an incredible uphill battle to get that kind of material into their outlets. And I think that the the administration has an incredibly powerful and loud megaphone, and it controls a lot of the message. And no matter what they say, it gets repeated, and it gets repeated enough that Americans who don't go much further than that for their information absorb that message as their construct or their picture of what's happening in Iraq. And I just think that's I think we have a much more profound responsibility when we send our troops overseas to fight and to die and to kill, and not even to mention the consequences for the Iraqis themselves. I think we as Americans have a tremendously more profound responsibility to understand that conflict and what it means and what those soldiers are doing and what they're coming back with, and that's something we're going to live with. I think our version of hell is going to be living with a very significantly damaged soldiers who come home to our population and will be living amongst us and need our help.
Let's go to questions from the audience. There is somebody traveling around with a microphone, I believe. Why don't you take those two questions right there? First the woman, then the man.
Hi. I was just interested with our presidential candidates with different opinions on our removal from our U.S. troops removal from the war. Are there repercussions to immediate removal of our troops?
You want to answer that, Haifa? I mean, it does seem we have a variety of views out there, in the sense that on the one hand, people say the less violence there is in Iraq, the more reason we should stay. The more violence that there is in Iraq, the more reason we should stay. And then there are those who say, but hey, we couldn't possibly leave. Haifa.
I think, the best strategy for the Americans and the whole world is for the troops to leave as soon as possible. There is no excuse, really. I mean, they are not staying there to look after Iraqi people, to defend them, or to establish democracy. Now it seems very clear to everybody. They are the problem in Iraq. So the sooner we get rid of them, the better we will be able also to build our country. That doesn't mean we are going to deny, or we are going, as a sovereign country in the future, to establish good relationships with any American or British government, but based on equality, not as occupied and occupiers. This is the difference. We have no intention whatsoever of drinking our oil. If you are after the oil, we will sign agreements regarding the oil and everything else, but based on equality and equal rights for both people. So this is the kind of future we want to build.
I'd also just like to add to that I think practically nobody that's running for president today is talking about a complete withdrawal of troops. They are talking about a drawdown, and that is quite nebulous. So I think the reality, certainly the demands of the resistance, and it has been consistent, and there is one demand ever since we were interviewing them in 2003, and it remains consistent, was re-articulated in a tribal meeting between the sheikhs in Qadamiyya just last week. Timetable for withdrawal, complete withdrawal, period. And nobody is politically talking about that here. And then I would just, on top of that, say that, the Iraqis are the descendants of the people that wrote the first human laws in history, or first laws in human history. They understand the confluence of tribal culture and tradition, religion, secularism, democracy, different forms of government. They are completely capable of determining the appropriate balance of those items in their legal code and their government, and should be allowed to do that for their own self-determination. And American presence is blocking that self-determination. And I think they have not only every right, but I think are paying for, again, our sort of, they're paying for our foreign policy ambitions and desires in the Middle East that is really not about them and their well-being, it's about us.
Yeah.
Assuming that the Iraqi government has its own way of, they form after the troops draw down, Do you think it would be, with the Iraqis calling the shots, would it be a partition government? Would it be a parliament government for all Iraq, or would it be a strong man? How do you think it would evolve into?
Do you want to start with that, Haifa?
Well, all the demands now and what we're working on is for a unified, independent Iraq. So it is a unified Iraq and totally independent. That's the basic thing. We are not glued together, as it's one of the myths nowadays in the academia and in the media, in the mainstream media, that Iraq has been glued together by the British in the 1920s, last century. It's not. Iraq has been existing as it is in present day borders, give and take a few miles here and there, thousands of years before Christianity. So long before the British government arriving or the American government. And there is no reason whatsoever to unglue it now in order to be accepted because there is a violence between the Sunni and Shiite and that. The other fact is worth mentioning is that we never had sectarian war in our history based on Sunni Shiite sectarian war. We never had that before. So how come suddenly out of the blue that in the 5 years of occupation we have this divide building up and things? We have to question these things. What we read, we have to question and to have the overall picture and then decide whether we are the British and American troops to stay there serving who is interest really and what they are doing there.
But let me ask you, Molly, I mean, there are people reporting, many people reporting from Iraq today who say there is no Iraqi state. This is a failed state with a government that doesn't function, with a structure that is more like kind of tribal militia leaders ruling different areas. Is it fair to say there even is such a thing as an Iraqi government and a country that can hold together here?
98% of Arab Iraqis polled think it's wrong to divide the country along sectarian lines and that it's proper to have a strong central government in Iraq. So, I mean, just to address the popular aspiration of the public. And then I would say that in my understanding and my reading about the current Iraqi government, which was installed after I left, actually, it is a particularly, again, as I said, the presidency, not the parliament, is composed of the parties that don't really have a significant popular base in Iraq. Scary, in particular, the exiles who came in do not have the street credibility, really, of somebody like Muqtada Sadr, whose family, his father was assassinated by Saddam in '99. Sadr himself never left the country. The Iraqis recognize that he has gone through and experienced the history of Iraq in the last 30, 40 years in the way that they have. There was a pretty interesting piece in the New York Times, I think in the Week in Review section last week, about the alley fighter, right? And how Saddam knew the physical alley, I'm sorry, not Saddam, Sadr knew, Sadr knew the physical alleys, and his people knew the physical alleys of Iraq, and he knew the political alleys and corridors in a way that the exiles don't either completely understand, or it's irrelevant whether they do because they don't have the base of support. And I mean, I think if we were to withdraw, without a doubt, this government would fall in a second. I mean, if they didn't leave with us, they would be killed or be chased out of the country. So I think that is a reality, but I think that, I mean, just to be clear from the question before, I don't think it would be a kumbaya moment if the United States were to withdraw tomorrow. I think there would be fighting. But I do think that the Iraqis would figure it out, and the price that they have paid to date in the last 5 years, I think it would diminish, that fighting would diminish quite quickly as the tribes and the religious structures agreed on a shared sharing of power in a way that was appropriate.
What do you think might be the future of Muqtada al-Sadr and his forces? He's clearly got the upper hand right now. His view on the Iraqi occupation jibes with that of the vast majority of Iraqi people wanting the occupation to end.
Well, he will remain a real force on the ground, and we'll see, because there are other forces also within the resistance, and by that I mean the ex-army officers. There are secular forces as well. There is a faction of the old Communist Party fighting. There are the Arab nationalists. There are the Nasrites, so there are other factions fighting together. I don't think he will have the one say and the most powerful position there, because there are other forces. So the best solution is really, after the leaving of the foreign troops, that we will have a fair election to see who is going to win and whatever. And the parliament is also something we look forward to have in the future. So it is the shape of democratic country we hope to establish. And it will be left also to Iraqis themselves when they go to vote in a fair and with the presence of observers, not like it was happened the last time. We hope to continue the process which we started decades ago.
Another question. Let's go here and then there. Dark blue and then lighter blue.
How do you suggest we overcome what seems to me to be a huge propaganda that, for example, McCain says we may have to stay there 100 years, but we're going to stay until victory. And I mean, victory to me looks as though it's going to resemble Hiroshima if we attempt to have American victory in Iraq. So how do we overcome that propaganda that the only way to achieve peace in Iraq is for America to stay until there is peace and harmony, when from all that you were saying is we are, as you say, the problem, not the solution?
Well, my answer is I can tell you a bit about what we want to do and how we achieve it, but I'll be willing to listen to you telling me what to do about the problems here, especially about the elections, because it seems like it's going to be here a dominant issue for months and months to come. And obviously, I mean, McCain wants to stay 100 years. He can stay 200 years, I mean, if he wishes. But will he be able to stay? I mean, he can claim whatever he likes. Iraqi people in their unique resistance, and as Molly mentioned, it's documented that they started fighting and resisting 1 week after the occupation. And they determined, I mean, the majority of Iraqi people, they want unified Iraq, they want independent Iraq, and they're willing also to sacrifice their lives to achieve that. They are not going to accept occupation. So it is up to the American people to decide themselves what to do with their rulers. We are trying to deal with our problems there inside, so I am in no position to advise people here what to do, except that I appeal for the solidarity, international solidarity and help, and try to also just hoping that to build bridges among people based on equality. The tactics, the way how you deal with your problems, and I'm sure you are creative enough to invent, to do something different. It's not enough anymore. From my own experience in Britain, it's not enough anymore to just demonstrate. Go on a Saturday when it's sunny, you have many people. When it's raining, you don't have. You apply for permission from the police and you walk there, you go back home and you feel good about yourself. You achieve something. This is not going to help us. It's not going to help you, because after all, you are paying high for this senseless war. You're not benefiting from it anymore. We have to have different ways.
Where, and this is into the propaganda, well, Iraqis have hated each other, Sunni Shia have hated each other for centuries. There's nothing we can do. The best thing is just to divide them. and then we'll stand between them as the honorable job of keeping this war from happening. And that mandates, I mean, that accomplishes something, because it mandates a permanent or long-term American military presence in the country and then in the Middle East, and has the benefit of sandwiching Iran between Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, there's a geopolitical issue happening, which I think, again, has very little to do with the Iraqis themselves or what we aspire to, but our foreign policy objectives for the region and what we would like, you know, the fact that we want to have a strong controlling aspect to what unfolds there.
There.
It's very clear to all of us how you feel about what should happen. I'd like to concentrate a little bit more on violence after the occupation ends, which you alluded to and started off. Suppose it ends in the next couple of months. All quote-unquote occupying forces and contractors who have guns leave. What do you both think will be the security situation for a certain period of time, or whatever time? And secondly, and somewhat related or not, you mentioned that the Shiites and the Sunnis historically weren't fighting each other. Why are they fighting each other now?
Well, if we go back to the 90s, and that's regarding the second part of your question, why they are fighting now. We witnessed the establishment of a few political parties in London and in Washington. They were based on sectarian divide. They were they were funded by the US and strengthened by. And we know that they issued also a statement, a gathering of them, they called the Shiite House statement. And they came also, there is this myth that Saddam Hussein was a Sunni, and the Shiite were persecuted by it because they were Shiite. Not. This is a myth, because Saddam Hussein was, if he was anything, he was just in his oppression for all the people who they were really opposing him. So there was he made no difference whatsoever. When his son opposed him, he almost killed him. He killed so many of his own family because they were really rebellion against him. So it was an idea then that it is important to divide the Iraqi people. The Kurds, of course, there is different story because they are ethnic, they were fighting for a long time, but then became this picture. We have Sunni, the minority ruling the Shias, the oppressed people, and then the Kurds and all the stuff. And they moved on to Iraq. And immediately after moving there and under Paul Bremer, the sectarian and ethnic divide became so clear that even the Communist Party, when they have a representative in the CPA, he was chosen for being a Shiite, a communist who never been, the man never been knowing anything about religions. He was chosen for being a Shiite in the quota system. So the quota started following from one thing to another. They started writing their draft constitution. So the committee to write the constitution, although the constitution itself, the draft came ready-made from Washington also, and Noah Feldman wrote it, still, I mean, the rest of the committee was divided into sectarian and ethnic, and everything followed. The ministries is divided. The Ministry of Education is following one militia rather than the sect, the other one. The Ministry of Health is following this, belong to this, and divided the whole thing. So this is what's happening now. Militias are fighting each other. Even within the green zone, people who are within the green zone are fighting based on the sectarian and ethnic divide. So it is the monster which being created that started to swallow, almost devour them. And sorry about the first
Second part of the question was, couldn't that monster then, I mean, to paraphrase, really play out once U.S. forces leave?
I think no, it's not going, because what's happened is, like at the end of during the French resistance, the end of it, where there people who were collaborators, being given the freedom of a few days to decide for themselves whether to leave or not to leave or to stay. I think most of the people, and if you look at the cabinet ministers at the moment and the head of the political parties, most of them, they have their families outside Iraq. They don't trust them to have them inside Iraq, so they already halfway out. And anything, the minute we get rid of the army, of the mercenaries, because it's not just the US Army there and the British. We have the mercenaries, we have the security forces, the firms, everybody's there and it's open. If all those will leave, with the corruption they created, which made Iraq one of the highest corrupted countries in the world, and we're talking about billions, not millions anymore, of the corruption money, believe me, Iraq is going to really go back together. It will not take one day, 1 week or another, but they are more than capable to live together and work together. And we have the intermarriages. We have in Baghdad alone, 1/3 of the population mixed with Kurdish and Arab. We are mixed. We are mixed down to the roots. Each family, you cannot find a Sunni family separated totally from a Shiite family. That does not exist in Iraq.
I'm just going to talk about American actions a little bit. When Bremer came in, one of the first things he did is set up the governing council, appointed the governing council along strict sectarian and ethnic lines, right? So for the first time in a long time, Iraqis woke up and said, I'm not Iraqi anymore. I now, for my political representation, have to identify with my representative. The second thing that happened quite quickly on the heels of that was the use of who we were interviewing and talking to is accurately described as the Sunni insurgency or the Sunni resistance, although there were Shia who were participating. And the United States military, unable to confront or identify these people, employed 2 pre-existing militias that come into the country with the invasion. One is the Peshmerga, the Kurds, and the other is the Badr Brigade, the Shia that came in with Skiri, right? So you have using them against the Sunni resistance fighters early on in 2003, right? So you have a political triangulation, then you have a military triangulation quite quickly on. And then the Americans start putting money on the ground, right, for information about who's opposing them. So you have families starting to turn against each other. You start having these problems emerge out of the actions of the United States. Then the disbanding of the army, which as Haifa was talking about earlier, was one of the great national cohesive elements in Iraq, was disbanded. So you have these strong forces, sort of centripetal forces, and every nation has fissures within its society. And I think what ended up happening with the invasion is the kind of pressure that was applied on those fissures, and those became wedges and then became canyons. And those divisions are realer now than they were. But I think also the sectarian one in particular, the Sunni Shia one, is the shallowest scrape or cut, if you will. The tribal structure is incredibly profound and deep into Iraqi society, and that, I think, is intact. The religious structures are very deep and very strong, and they remain. And I think the longer the occupation it stays, the worse these divisions become and the harder they are to heal. If the occupation were to end expeditiously, I think that healing would take place and would be able to happen.
I want to save time for people to be able to buy and get signed Haifa's book and find out more about the film. So I'm going to take one last question, then we can continue this around the book signing table.
I am going to be also selling copies of the
and
film.
Molly's also going to be selling copies of Meeting Resistance.
I am very confused because as I understand, there has been ethnic cleaning in Iraq. And what I am hearing from the two of you is that it is the fault of the United States invasion that has created this ethnic cleaning. And I think that if ethnic cleaning is going to come in any country, there has to be some years where something has been developing for this to happen. It cannot just happen because the US invaded. Did it happen when England was there?
Molly.
The
We'll start with
20s?
Molly and then come to
And
Haifa.
I think it's happening because of those actions, largely because of those actions that I just explained, and other much more complicated issues, but also the exiles who came in 2003, who have the objective of dividing the country, with the ambition of creating statelets that are highly independent and control the oil resources, frankly, and are able to, they want to privatize the oil resources and have the capacity to independently, as these individual statelets, negotiate oil deals with Western companies. If you have a central government where the oil is nationalized, that doesn't happen. So if you're going to divide the country, you have to sow that division. So it's not just the American presence, it's also the exiles and those within Iraq who aspire to divide the country are feeding that hate, that hatred, feeding that violence between communities, not just between Sunni Shia, but between the different ethnic groups. So I think, it is not all entirely at the United States doorstep, but if we weren't there or if we had never gone, it would be different as well.
Haifa, to you. But let's just answer the question about whether this had happened under the British.
Can I? Yeah.
Well, let's Haifa respond. Sir, let me just get. We got the question. Let's let Haifa respond.
Well, I think if you put yourself in a country like Iraq, where you are subjected to continuous killing every day and the bombardment every day, I'm talking every day is someone, and there is average of one Iraqi killed at a checkpoint every 3 hours at the checkpoint, which is manned by Americans, and this is a figure by the Pentagon, you will realize how deep things has changed and how volatile the situation is. And I'll give you one example. I live in London, and in London, within 1 week of a shortage of oil, there were cars queuing in front of petrol stations, and I've seen 1 week only without petrol, 2 people were almost killing each other because they were competing to get the petrol from the station. Iraqis, for their credit and for their really resilience in the last 5 years, despite all the powers of the Americans and their willingness to divide Iraq, and also the power of all the mercenaries existing there, which is a parallel army to the multinational forces, what's called multinational forces. And those people are not there to establish peace, but the more they feed, they live on feeding and killing people. The car bombs, they're not all, who's implanting that? The destruction of mosques. Every destruction of a mosque will lead to the feeling of anger and outrage, and people want to take revenge from this side and another. Yet, there is no civil war in Iraq. Most of the fighting is not ethnic cleansing. That's different phenomena. We're talking about sectarian, because about militias being established and paid. Each leader of a party brought their relatives, they paying them. And the money there in Iraq paid to these militias in sacks. It isn't only in checks but in sacks money. In fact, the Americans now, and they are very proud, Bush on the 5th anniversary, he said he was hailing the awakening, the surge, the success of the surge. One of the commanders in one small area in Baghdad called Dore, he paid in cash $32 million to a group of people in order to establish security in that area. How can you face that?
And the last news I heard was that those members of the awakening groups who were previously Sunni organizations, many of them fighting the U.S., are very angry they haven't received their most recent
Their
payments.
salaries, yeah.
Nor been incorporated into the Interior Ministry and the police and army in the way that they were supposed to be because of the divisions.
All this being the case, if you accept that if maybe they weren't there originally, but there has now been created the kind of division that we've been talking about tonight, all that still being the case, you say the U.S. forces should all leave as immediately, totally?
Definitely. That's the only solution. Or the fighting will continue, the killing will continue, and that will touch on every single life in Iraq, and it will deepen whatever fraction there is. It's a wound. I mean, it will be a wound and continuously bleeding. If we won't give it the time to heal, that will continue. And it is worrying. It is worrying for us. We are fighting and we are scared. And the only solution we find, and it's a demand which we keep saying, and we've been repeating it, there should be an immediate withdrawal of the troops and also the reparations for Iraqi people. You cannot leave them. The destruction you've done is horrendous. The killing is horrendous, so people have to be compensated. That's the only way, a showing of a goodwill by the American people in order to establish good relationship in the future. Otherwise, I mean, I think the whole world is threatened.
Steve had dinner a few months ago, I wasn't there sadly, with a very senior Special Forces officer in the United States military who is part of the planning structure in Baghdad. And he said to Steve, the only way we're going to win this situation militarily is to commit genocide. He was not advocating that. But what he was doing was making the point the American people don't understand that this is an intractable military problem that is not feasible to have a military solution. And as long as, I mean, I agree with Haifa entirely. I mean, I don't see any positive benefit for the Iraqis in particular of a continued military presence in Iraq.
We're going to leave it there and go to the table at the back. I want to thank Molly Bingham.
Thank you.
Haifa Zangana.
Thank you.
And all of you for coming out. Thanks so much. And to the Hammer.
We'll do the book signing upstairs at the bookstore.
We will do the book signing upstairs at the bookstore. See you there.